Hi, everyone. One thing that wasn't covered in the introduction is I got my start, my first job at Hewlett-Packard in 1980, working on the HP 2250 measurement control processor. So I have a little bit of industrial control in my background. But today we're talking about learning from a case study, recent ransomware attack at Norsk Hydro. And the goal of today's 30-minute presentation is to give you a flavor of what a quantitative risk analyst does with publicly available information. So it may help you if you have a casual interest in making use of information, and it may help a small number of people here who have ambitions to really take on the challenge of quantifiable risk estimation, whether it's in support of making cyber insurance decisions or if you're trying to help drive decisions. So we're going to look at the Norsk Hydro as a case study, but it's really not about Norsk Hydro, the details of the event. Most of you know about the technical details of the ransomware event. We're really there to understand how you might assemble the information into a risk estimation. And we're also going to be looking at the role of cyber insurance, how it played out in this case, and how it may play out in your decision making regarding risk and investment and your prioritization. So here's a preview of my main points. First point, think cash flows. Second point, think bow ties. Third point, think like a catastrophe risk analyst. This is my colleague, Gordon Wu. He has the title catastrophist. Fragility matters. And the last point is, cheese with holes can still be good cheese. So Norsk Hydro is the 7th largest aluminum supplier in the world, 4th largest outside of China. On March 19th, they announced publicly that they were a victim of a ransomware attack. And one of the things that Norsk Hydro did, and the reason why they're a topic of this presentation is they did a pretty phenomenal job at public communication to the general public as well as to their direct supply chain. So this affected their extruded products, and that's, I don't know if you can see the colors on here. The purple dots here are all their extruded products divisions. So you can see it's pretty worldwide. So the reason why this has all this attention is, oh my God, is ransomware taking over industrial controls? Well, of course, all of you people know it did not invade their industrial control systems. In fact, it only affected Office-based systems, Microsoft Windows. And the other key thing about this attack from a technical standpoint is this was a targeted attack. This was not contagious malware like the NotPetya and WannaCry attacks. So one of the things from a risk analysis point of view, and maybe some of you went through this with your companies, maybe your top management said, oh my God, Norsk Hydro's been attacked. Are we going to be attacked? Is there something we need to do differently based on what they're doing? Well, knowing whether it's a contagious malware attack or a targeted attack could be crucial in making that decision. So, just to set the stage, how big was this? 48% of their endpoints, their PCs, personal computers, were infected, and about 33% of their servers. And about 15%, give or take, were actually encrypted. So it's pretty significant impact. Now, I mentioned before, RMS creates models of catastrophic risk for the insurance industry. The word catastrophic here simply means much larger than normal. The 1 in 10, the 1 in 50, the 1 in 100, the 1 in 1,000-year flood type events. So inside of these models, we build submodels to capture certain dynamics or certain mechanisms. And in the realm of contagious malware, one of the mechanisms we want to capture is if a contagious malware event happens, what percentage of an organization's computers are going to be infected, right? So we build up some contagious network models, and we come up with this probability distribution curve ranging between 0 and 100%. The midpoint is about 55%. And the red lines here show the actual history of what happened at Norsk Hydro. So you can see from the RMS modeling perspective, we would consider this a fairly typical event, assuming it was contagious malware. But the lesson here is even a target attack, once they get inside and they achieve that lateral movement, can achieve the same level of network penetration as a contagious malware vector would have. So Norsk also publicized their estimate of the financial impact here in Norwegian kroner. So we get up to 300 million a quarter. So how big is a kroner? And 300 million, is that a lot? Well, if you're like David Putty, you try to struggle to understand this. But if you're like the rest of us, we might prefer to have this in dollars. So in dollars, I think most of us are used to thinking in those terms. A $75 million event is pretty big. It's big enough to be reported to their shareholders, but it's not big enough to move their financial statements very big. Now, it's one thing to see what's reported on financial statements. It's another to say, are there broader impacts that may show up in months and years later? Are they losing market share, or are they getting in trouble with regulators? So in the Norsk case, you know, we track the press releases and the analyst reports. It's possible even to look into their competitors to see, is Norsk suffering competitively? And we don't see any evidence of that. So often as a risk analyst, you have to draw some inferences from the absence of evidence when there is usually some relevant indicators. So let me give you an example of an indicator of impact that usually is a signal of a lot of other things. If executives lose their jobs, even though that doesn't show up on a financial statement, that can be a very powerful indicator as to how much impact that has internally. Likewise, with the existence of class action lawsuits. So the evaluation of credit rating agencies is also important. Some of you may know that Moodys and others are starting to factor in cyber risk in some of their credit evaluations. Well, it turns out Moodys issued a credit evaluation for some debt that Norsk Hydro was issuing just after the breach event. So they maintained their medium rating, triple B2 is what the rating is, but it has a negative outlook. Well, if you read farther down, they do mention the cyber issue, but the only relevant factor is we're uncertain about the insurance recovery. There was a whole host of things that Norsk was dealing with that was creating this negative circumstance, and the cyber issue did not make the list as driving that negative outlook. So this is all factoring into how my company or any company that's doing quantitative risk assessment would try to gather publicly available information. And I apologize for this slide. I meant to blow up some of the bullet points, but this is taken from their investor information brochure, which is quite informative. But what you see on the bar chart over here are the ups and downs on a quarterly basis from this extruded solutions. And on the right-hand side, a bunch of small bullets about all the earnings drivers. So it talks about contract structure. It talks about variable versus fixed costs, costs of supply, and so forth. There's a huge number of things that have a large effect on the profitability of this particular division. And cyber risk, relatively speaking, is not at the highest level. So here's another way to evaluate this. What happened with their share price? So the blue line here indicates when the breach event happened. You see a modest uptick up just after the breach event. But But overall, the breach event did not interrupt this downward decline through 2018 into 2019, in part because they were dealing with some executive turnover, some regulatory action, a big toxic spill in Brazil that they had to shut down some operations and pay fines. So a whole number of operational issues that were going on at the same time that they had this big breach. So let's talk about dollars. Those of us who've been trained in engineering, in security, we might think that our world is complicated, but the world of dollars is simple. A dollar is a dollar is a dollar. So one of my takeaways to you today is when it comes to decision making around cyber risk, there is incongruous points of view that you can never completely resolve, and you have to always know what point of view you're dealing with in order to talk authoritatively about the cost. So there's the point of view of the investment decision maker who's making decision about capital equipment, for example. There's a point of view of the accountant who's reporting to shareholders or the tax authorities. The tax accountant deals with depreciation and goodwill and all of those things that the capital investment analysis completely ignores or deals with in a different way. You also have the law, and you have the insurance companies. And you cannot reconcile any one of these points of view with a single measure of breach cost or cybersecurity. You always have to be pivoting back and forth between them. But I want all of you here, because I'm assuming we don't have lawyers and we don't have financial accountants. I assume that all of you here work for operating companies or your consultants. I want you to think like an investor in capital equipment, and I want you to think discounted cash flow. In today's presentation, I don't have time to go through this very much, but there are plenty of books available for it. But I want to emphasize three things. First of all, always forward-looking analysis. How many of you have heard, show of hands, of the sunk cost fallacy, right? You can't make decisions based on what you've gained and lost already in the past. You should only look for what you might gain and lose in the future, right? That's that forward-looking perspective. Next thing I want you to remember is $1 today is always worth more than $1 next year, and a certain dollar is always worth more than an uncertain dollar. When you think about insurance recoveries, they always come months and sometimes years later. There's always uncertainty about the amount of the recovery. So if you want to maximize your discounted cash flow, you're going to think about ways to prevent the loss in the first place or mitigate it as quickly as possible rather than counting on an uncertain time-deferred insurance payment. And please, please, please don't ever combine backward-looking and forward-looking analysis. There are certain analysts who are quite famous in the world of cost of a data breach who commit this sin, in my opinion. They shall go unnamed. So, second point, think bow ties. So what do I mean by this? This diagram here is called a bow tie model or bow tie analysis. So the loss event is in the center. On the left-hand side are all the activities or conditions that lead up to the loss event, and everything on the right-hand side are the consequences. Okay? And the little eyeball icon here is meant to represent this is the way that you're modeling all of this, right? So that even if you are in the middle of it or the event has already happened, you're still updating your forward-looking model. So here's a slightly more technical version, and I realize that you probably can't see this from the floor here. But if you've been trained in reliability engineering, the left-hand side can be viewed as a fault tree. So these are conditions, probabilistic conditions, and logical relations among them that can lead up to the loss event. And this is quite different than a lot of quantitative risk methods in security, because they often put assets, IT assets, or IT services here as the nodes. But I think it's much more valuable to think of conditions associated with What is going to bring that attack or that loss event about? The right-hand side is sometimes called an event tree. I prefer to think of it as a branching activity model, which I'm going to describe in a few seconds. So on that right-hand side, it's useful to start out with some broad categories of losses. And I tend to think of losses in terms of cost, even if it's something squishy like reputation. And I would frame it this way. What would I pay today to avoid reputation loss in the future, assuming that I had to bank all the money today? So this list of loss categories is not meant to be exhaustive. In fact, you may have loss scenarios that hardly involve any of these, but this is to get you thinking about what's called activity-based costing that drives the loss amount. So the first two, A and B, technical response, legal response, these are probably baked into your standard procedures 90% of the time. You should be able to cost them out by evaluating how many people you have on them and what do they typically do under different scenarios. Item C, changes to controls. This is the cost of technical debt, right? So if you read about the most egregious breach cases, companies have had to go back and spend considerable amount of money. CISOs have lost their jobs because they have to re-architect their security, they have to re-architect their IT in order to make up for past problems. The biggest category, D through G here, are all conditional on the situation. What arises in the course of the breach? So I advocate thinking about this as a branching activity, which is another fancy way of saying one thing leads to another. You get started on your technical response. In the middle of it, you discover, oh my God, we've got a nation-state actor at work here, so we've got to spawn some new activities. Or we've got our supply chain involved. We have to spawn some new activities. But if you break it down by process, and you think of these as time-based and resource-based, it's much easier to get an estimate of their cost and their variability than if you try to lump them together or put together one of the spreadsheets from hell that try to map this all out. The red stars here are the really critical thing because these are the branching points where one thing can spawn another. And the blue numbers here simply indicate the branching probability. And it's possible to put together a Monte Carlo simulation of this. I'm going to pause on this slide in case you want to take a photograph. We've published a paper on how to do this and has some examples worked out. I would contend people with your skill set will be able to follow this procedure and at least on a pilot test should be able to achieve some results. So what do we know about the breakout of costs in the Norsk Hydro case? Unfortunately, our friend here has told us not very much. So the third point is I want you to think like my colleague Gordon Wu and think like a catastrophe risk analyst. And this is not sky is falling, doomsday type thinking. And it's also not in some mathematical nirvana with swimming in a pool of ideal data. It's more like this. It's more like paleontology. You first look out and you see a pile of rubble and it looks like a mess, and what can I make of this? But you isolate the things that are important. You fit them together in a useful way, combine them with available theory, and if you're good at it and if you're persistent, you end up with a risk model you can do something with. So let's talk about the evidence. So there's plenty of evidence in the Norsk Hydro case for business interruption and IT recovery cost. And there's no evidence, absence, in these other categories. Probably can't read this slide, but this is from the PR material, the public information about how they responded. Here's a bunch of anecdotes and frontline stories about what individual departments and groups did. Now, this is one of the most useful pieces of information, and this shows the type of investigation work that a risk analyst would do to try to tease out what's really going on. So this slide describes manual effort which can be very costly because, it's not automated and it doesn't scale and so forth. But I bet you, so the first blue line talks about printing out the entire order book for a particular business unit. And the second blue line talks about 1,300 kilometer trek that a particular team had to do to get information back and forth. So what's important about this is these are costly and critical activities to Norsk Hydro's recovery, but I bet you they appeared nowhere in their cost estimation. Why? Because these are using existing resources and you're moving them around and they don't necessarily impact your financial statement. But if you're not planning on this and if you're not accounting for this in your decision making, you're going to be missing the boat. Here is a slide that was posted on Twitter. The key information for me as a risk analyst are the two bullets at the bottom. I'm going to read them off. Fatigue in the organization, heavy workload over time, and they experience an increase in fraud and phishing attempts after the breach. Now, I'm not sure I would have known to anticipate an increase in frequency in fraud and phishing attempts after a breach, but that's useful information that I can factor into my risk models. So another class of information are comparable cases. It turns out the same threat actor was engaged in a whole campaign, hit Norsk Hydro and at least four other companies in the industrial and materials group. This helps fill in some missing pieces about, did they have cyber insurance, how much the recovery is it partial or complete, what's the magnitude of the gross loss. Turns out nobody paid the ransom that we know of. Only half of the companies appeared to encounter business interruption. Only one of the companies paid for third-party forensic services. And nobody paid for an external PR firm, which is real interesting. I think a lot of the firms that were hit with NotPetya ended up spending a lot of money on external PR. Now, the last column is really important. Complications. Are there complications involved? And what do I mean by that? So in 3 of these cases, Norsk Hydro had complications that were in place prior to the breach. The CEO had just retired early, apparently on fairly short notice, and so they had to avoid the executive ranks who had to make very quick and authoritative decisions about how they're going to respond to this. In another corporate setting, that could have been a disaster because that replacement may not have been comfortable or there may have been blame games involved. And they were also already under legal sanctions I mentioned from the spillage. These other 2 cases, Hexion and Nystart, they were in bad financial shape. And I'll skip over the details of here in the interest of time, but I want everybody here who's working for a company that might be highly leveraged, or it's in a low margin, volatile business, or it's in the course of some merger and acquisition, if you've got a low credit rating, or if you've had a lot of executive turnover, that puts you in a state of fragility that could have multiplier effects on breach impact. And really good breach impact models, and I'm not saying that anybody's perfected this yet, would take into account the fragility of the target organization and not just the technical or even the asset impact of that breach. So another key piece of information, really vital for this type, is who's the threat actor and what are their capabilities. So from the outside, as outside analysts, we can infer a whole bunch of things because a Russian cybercrime group was attributed to this. And it wasn't a state actor. It wasn't a cybercrime group that had previous industrial control type experience or capability. And it turns out this appears to be a pretty large-scale experiment, and they're searching for other low-hanging fruit in the ransomware arena. And their previous experiences in retail and a whole bunch of other places, again, executing ransomware. So this helps frame why these attacks didn't have industrial control implications. And from a counterfactual standpoint, you can say, what if another attacker came in with the exact same tools and techniques, but they did have that ICS capability? That would change things dramatically. So let's switch to cyber insurance. And my fifth point. So here's what we know about Norsk Hydro's cyber coverage. We know AIG is the primary carrier, and that's about it, unfortunately. We do have a little bit of information about partial payments. So one of the things I want to communicate, cyber insurance is not simple. It's not simple in the way that industrial controls is reducible to on-off switches. So in just the remaining few minutes, I want to communicate some of the subtleties and complexities that may lead you to a more nuanced understanding. So the area of the central rectangle in this diagram is proportional to the dollar amount of cost associated with the cyber breach within the scope of insurance coverage. And everything off to the side, including all of that overtime and other things, are going to be exclusions. Okay? Now, the exclusion territory, if you ever look at a cyber insurance or any business insurance contract, you may feel like you're stuck inside of a Marx Brothers movie. The complexities of the contract can get very intricate. But I'm going to reduce it to a few parameters that maybe you can wrap your heads around. So every cyber insurance or property insurance contract will have some limits on the low side and the upside, and often has what's called participation. So they may insure you between $1 million and $50 million, but they may only cover 50% or 25% or 80% of that loss. And they do this for diversification, liquidity, solvency purposes, because the insurance companies do not have the same interests as the people they insure. Okay? And what this leads to, and by the way, there's a whole bunch of other complications that step in, is you can end up with what's called a tower of insurance. As you can see, it sort of builds on each other in a mosaic fashion, but it inevitably has holes, right? So if anybody ever says, oh, don't worry about cyber breach above X because they have insurance or we have insurance, that is a naive and misleading observation. And no matter how good insurance you get, there's going to be some upper limits, there's going to be some gaps here and there, because that's just the nature of the marketplace. I'm going to skip over a couple of these points. Here's some academic research. By the way, I've posted the slides on my blog, and I'm on Twitter at Mr. Meritology. This is an academic study of 69 cyber insurance policies that were posted in the US. And 58% of these cover business interruption. A smaller percent, 42%, cover extortion. And less than 2%, only one out of this total, covers the overtime costs that are mentioned before. So there's a lot of non-standardization involved. Skip over this. So to wrap this up, you may be here in conversation, or you yourselves may have said, oh, when we think about risk, we need to think about the option of risk transfer. But from an operational, stakeholder, financial perspective, it really isn't transfer. They aren't actually taking it. They are taking some of the cost, but it's delayed in time, and there's uncertainty about it, and there's all kinds of constraints where cyber insurance is not a complete substitute for preventative activity or security procedures or other things. In fact, it's best considered a form of risk finance to help you survive critical breaches in the same way that your borrowing capacity, or your ability to sell assets, your ability to redeploy assets are. Okay, so these are all ways to finance your operation in the face of ongoing loss events. Think of cyber insurance in that way. So I want to thank you for your time. I've got my email here. Again, I'm on Twitter as Mr. Meritology. And for those of you who are able to type or Google, my blog is called Exploring Possibility Space. And I want to thank you very much.